In the velvet hush of a winter evening, the gilded hearth glowed like a jewel box tucked into the city's pulsing core. Its chandeliers cast prisms of light that danced across polished mahogany, their radiance softening the edges of a world built on wealth and whispers. The restaurant, a sanctuary for the elite, hummed with the quiet elegance of clinking crystal and the delicate strains of a violin weaving through the air. Each table was an island of influence, adorned with starched linens and silver that gleamed like moonlight. In the farthest corner, half hidden by a cascade of ivy and shadow, sat Elias Hart, a man of 46, whose name was synonymous with innovation and fortune. His tailored suit, a study in charcoal and precision, clung to his frame with effortless grace, and the faint glint of a gold watch at his wrist caught the occasional flicker of candlelight. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, a hollow ache lingered, a void no amount of success could fill. Elias gazed at the untouched plate before him, a delicate arrangement of seared scallops and saffron-infused risotto, its aroma rich but uninviting. Across from him, an empty chair held court, its silence louder than the murmur of the room. His fingers traced the stem of a glass of Cabernet, the wine's deep crimson swirling like a memory he couldn't release. 12 years had passed since the fire that claimed his wife, Clara, and their 5-year-old daughter, Ivy. The tragedy had left him a ghost in his own life, his days filled with boardrooms and acquisitions, his nights with the weight of absence. He lifted the glass, the motion mechanical, as if the act of drinking could drown the quiet. But before the rim touched his lips, a voice broke through the stillness, soft yet piercing, like a single note struck on a piano in an empty hall. A young woman stood beside his table, no older than 20, her presence an anomaly in the opulent space. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose braid, strands fraying like threads of a well-worn tapestry. Her coat, too thin for the biting cold outside, hung loosely over her slight frame, its edges frayed and stained. In her arms, she cradled a child, a boy no more than 9 months old, wrapped in a faded quilt patched with care. The boy's eyes, wide and curious, fixed on the golden mound of risotto, steam curling from the plate like a promise. The woman's voice, though barely above a whisper, carried a weight that silenced the room. Diners paused, their forks suspended, as the air grew thick with unspoken judgment. A waiter moved forward, his brow creased with unease, but Elias raised a hand, a subtle gesture that held the authority of a man accustomed to command. He studied her face, searching for something beyond the surface. There was no plea in her expression, no trace of calculation or shame. Only exhaustion, etched into the lines around her eyes, and a fierce, quiet resolve that seemed to burn brighter than the candles. She held the child with a tenderness that eclipsed the room's grandeur, her posture a shield against the world. She wasn't begging, she wasn't scheming, she was surviving, her every breath tethered to the small life in her arms. Elias felt his throat tighten, a sensation foreign after years of numbness. The candle between them flickered, casting fleeting shadows across her face. In that moment, something stirred within him, not a revelation, but a spark, faint yet undeniable. Unbeknownst to him, that single question, that fleeting encounter, would unravel the fortress he had built around his heart. The room seemed to hold its breath as Elias pushed the plate forward, the motion deliberate, almost reverent. The woman didn't rush toward the food, didn't seize it with the desperation one might expect. Instead, she reached into a worn satchel slung across her shoulder and produced a small square of cloth, clean but frayed at the edges, as if it had been washed 1,000 times. With careful precision, she wrapped the risotto and scallops, folding the cloth as if it held something sacred. Then, kneeling gently, she balanced the child on her hip and retrieved a small plastic spoon from her coat pocket. Elias watched, transfixed, as she scooped a modest portion of the warm food, blowing softly to cool it before guiding it to the boy's lips. The child's mouth opened instinctively, his tiny tongue darting out, and when the risotto touched it, he let out a soft, gurgling sound of delight. The boy's face lit up, his chubby hands clapping against his mother's chest, a smile breaking across his cheeks like dawn after a long night. Elias felt a pang, sharp and unbidden, as the child's joy echoed a memory he had buried deep. The smile was not unlike Ivy's, those fleeting moments when her laughter had filled their home. He looked away, just for a second, as a mist gathered in his eyes, but his gaze returned as the boy sighed contentedly, the warmth of a single bite enough to spark joy. The woman continued feeding him, her movements steady, her focus singular. She didn't glance at the other diners, didn't acknowledge the weight of their stares. Her world, in that moment, was her son, and nothing else mattered. When the boy seemed satisfied, she tucked the wrapped food back into her satchel, adjusted the quilt around him, and rose. Her eyes met Elias's for a brief moment, and she offered a slight nod, not of gratitude, but of acknowledgement, as if recognizing something unspoken between them. Then she turned, threading Miguel's system, navigating the sea of white tablecloths and candlelight to the glass doors of the restaurant, disappearing into the chill of the night. Elias remained seated, his gaze fixed on the spot where she had stood. The candle on his table flickered, casting ripples of gold across the untouched wine and the empty chair. The world he knew seemed to dissolve into a distant hum, leaving only the image of her frayed coat and the child's radiant smile. Without fully understanding why, he rose, his movements quiet but resolute. He placed his napkin on the table, nodded to the stunned waiter, and stepped into the night, following the invisible thread that pulled him toward her. The city's pulse faded as he trailed her at a distance, her silhouette moving swiftly through the frost-kissed streets. She slipped into a narrow alley, clutching the boy tightly, her steps cautious yet determined, as if every shadow held a threat. Elias followed, his polished shoes silent on the damp pavement, driven by something deeper than curiosity, a recognition, perhaps, of a pain he knew too well. The alley opened into a crumbling lot, surrounded by brick walls tagged with faded graffiti. Among the rusted relics of abandoned cars stood a weathered hatchback, its paint chipped, its windows fogged with condensation. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a refuge, a fragile barrier against the world. She approached the car without hesitation, opening the back door and settling inside with the boy. A thin blanket served as a makeshift bed, and she nestled him close, her lips moving in a soft murmur, a lullaby too faint to carry. Elias lingered in the shadows, his breath catching as her voice rose, fragile but unwavering, singing of sunshine and dreams. The boy's tiny hand grasped her collar, his eyes fluttering shut as the melody wrapped around him like a shield. The scene was stark, the car's interior lit only by the dim glow of a street lamp, but the love within it was undeniable, a force that outshone the city's cold indifference. Elias felt rooted to the spot, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Something stirred in the air, and she turned, her eyes locking onto his with a flash of alarm. Elias stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. He didn't approach too closely, sensing the fragility of the moment. Her gaze held his, wary but steady, weighing the stranger in the tailored coat. After a long pause, she relaxed slightly, her shoulders softening, though her grip on the boy remained firm. She introduced herself as Lena, her voice quiet but clear, and named the boy Theo. Elias nodded, repeating the names as if they were a lifeline. He mentioned the scene in the restaurant, the way she had fed her son with such care, and admitted it had stirred something in him he couldn't explain. Lena's expression didn't change, but her eyes softened, as if she recognized the weight of his words. She shared a fragment of her story, her tone matter-of-fact, devoid of self-pity. A former art student, she had been derailed by pregnancy, abandoned by the father and cast out by her family. For 3 months, she and Theo had lived in the car, surviving on odd jobs and fleeting kindnesses. Elias glanced at the vehicle, noting the neatly folded baby clothes, the cracked dashboard adorned with a single drawing, a child's scribble of a sun. He offered assistance, a place to stay, a meal, anything she needed, but Lena stopped him with a raised hand. She didn't want charity, she said. She wanted one night of safety for Theo, one night where he could sleep without the cold seeping through the cracks. Her words struck Elias like a quiet thunderclap, their simplicity cutting through his guarded heart. In her eyes, he saw a flicker of Clara's resolve, not identical, but close enough to unravel something long buried. The way Lena held Theo, fierce and unyielding, mirrored a love he had once known, one he had lost to flame and ash. He stepped back, suddenly unsteady, the weight of the moment pressing against his ribs. He thanked her, his voice barely audible, for reminding him of something he thought he'd forgotten. Lena didn't respond, only resumed her lullaby, her voice weaving through the night like a beacon. Elias lingered a moment longer, the melody anchoring him to the spot. She didn't close the car door, and that small act felt like an invitation, a crack in the wall between their worlds. From that night, Lena and Theo became a quiet obsession for Elias. No matter how many meetings he chaired or contracts he signed, their faces lingered. A woman in tattered shoes and a boy with a smile like sunlight. The contrast gnawed at him, a city of excess where a mother and child survived on scraps of compassion. He didn't approach her again, not yet. Instead, he moved with the precision of a man who built empires, leaving small gifts near her car in the pre-dawn hours. A jar of baby food, a pack of diapers, a thermos of warm soup. He arranged for a doctor to visit, posing as a community outreach worker, ensuring Theo's health without revealing his hand. Lena never asked who sent the aid, but once, after the doctor left, she held Theo a little longer, whispering gratitude to the empty air. Her skepticism, honed by years of betrayal, began to soften. The gifts came without strings, without demands for gratitude or smiles. They were steady, quiet, real. Suspicion gave way to a tentative hope, a dangerous thing for a woman who had learned to expect disappointment. Elias watched from afar, his actions a bridge he wasn't sure she'd cross. But one frigid night, when the city seemed to hold its breath, everything changed. Theo had been restless all day, his cries sharp and unending. By evening, his skin burned with fever, his breath shallow and rapid. Lena tried everything, cool cloths, soft songs, rocking him in the car's cramped back seat, but his wails grew desperate. In a panic, she rushed to the nearest hospital, clutching him as if her will alone could keep him alive. At the emergency room, a clerk barely glanced up, her face impassive as Lena pleaded for help. Without insurance, she was told to wait or find another facility. Lena's voice broke, her words tumbling out in a rush as she described Theo's soaring fever, his unresponsiveness. The clerk's expression hardened, her response curt. Lena stumbled outside, the cold biting at her skin, Theo's silence more terrifying than his cries. With trembling hands, she typed a message into her battered phone, 2 words sent into the void. Help us. She didn't know if Elias would come, didn't know why she believed he might. But within minutes, headlights sliced through the darkness, and his sleek SUV screeched to a halt. Elias leapt out, his coat flapping in the wind, his eyes alight with urgency. Without a word, he reached for Theo, and Lena, her instincts warring with trust, placed the boy in his arms. Theo's tiny hand curled around Elias's finger, a faint but deliberate grip, as if sensing safety. Elias strode back into the hospital, his presence commanding the room. His voice, sharp with authority, demanded immediate care, promising to cover all costs and threatening consequences if delayed. Theo was admitted at once, and Lena sank into a chair in the sterile corridor, her body shaking with exhaustion. Elias stayed by her side, silent but steadfast as the hours ticked by under the hum of fluorescent lights. When a nurse reported that Theo was stable, resting comfortably, Lena exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her eyes, glassy with unshed tears, met Elias's, and for the first time she let herself break. She leaned into him, her sobs muffled against his chest, her body trembling with relief in something deeper, grief perhaps, or release. Elias held her, his arms steady, offering no platitudes, no demands. The moment stretched, a quiet communion between two souls who had known too much loss. For Lena, it was the first time she had allowed herself to falter since becoming a mother. For Elias, it was the first time in 12 years that holding someone didn't feel like a betrayal of the past. The hospital's fluorescent glow lingered in Elias's mind long after they left. Its stark light, a contrast to the soft dawn that greeted them outside. Theo, now cool to the touch and sleeping soundly in Lena's arms, was a fragile anchor grounding them both. Elias drove them to a quiet hotel, its understated elegance a far cry from the opulence of the Gilded Hearth. The room was simple but warm, with clean linens and a crib arranged by Elias's discreet call ahead. Lena settled Theo into the crib, her movements slow, as if testing the reality of a space that didn't smell of rust or gasoline. She stood over him, watching his chest rise and fall, her fingers brushing the quilt that had been their only constant. Elias lingered by the door, unsure of his place, his presence a silent offer of support she could accept or ignore. Lena didn't speak, but her shoulders, once rigid with vigilance, softened in the room's quiet. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her auburn braid unraveling, strands catching the morning light like embers. Elias watched her, noting the way exhaustion carved hollows beneath her eyes, yet her gaze held a fierce clarity, a mother's unyielding focus. He left without a word, returning an hour later with a bag of necessities, diapers, formula, a soft onesie in pale blue. Lena accepted them with a nod, her silence not cold but contemplative, as if weighing the cost of trust. Over the next days, Elias became a steady presence, arriving each morning with coffee or groceries, never pushing, never demanding. Theo's laughter, bright and unburdened, began to fill the room, a sound that pierced Elias's guarded heart like sunlight through a storm. The hotel became a temporary haven, but the world outside buzzed with whispers. A grainy photo, snapped by an onlooker in the hospital's parking lot, spread across social media, a shadowed image of Elias cradling Theo, Lena trailing behind, her face half hidden by her coat. The internet churned, weaving narratives from speculation. Some painted Elias as a savior, a billionaire with a heart of gold. Others sneered, labeling Lena a opportunist, her poverty a calculated trap. The headlines were relentless, each one a blade slicing at the fragile bond forming between them. Lena saw the posts late one night, the blue glow of her phone casting harsh shadows across her face. Each swipe brought a new accusation, a new distortion of her truth. Her hands trembled, not with anger, but with fear, not for herself, but for Theo, who deserved a life untainted by strangers' venom. She turned off the phone, the darkness swallowing the screen's glow, and sat motionless until dawn. When Elias arrived, he sensed the shift immediately. Lena's posture was closed, her eyes distant, as if she had rebuilt the walls he thought had begun to crumble. She didn't want Theo to grow up under the weight of lies, she admitted, her voice steady but raw. The world had already judged her, decided her story before she could tell it. Elias sat beside her, the space between them heavy with unspoken truths. He didn't offer promises or solutions, only listened, his silence a canvas for her pain. Then, with a resolve that surprised even himself, he decided to act, not for pity, but for justice, for the woman and child who had awakened something in him he thought was gone. That evening, Elias arranged a live broadcast, not through his usual channels of polished press releases, but a raw, unscripted appearance on a national network. The studio was bare, its lighting soft, stripping away the artifice of his public persona. He sat alone, his tailored suit replaced by a simple sweater, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. He began with Clara and Ivy, speaking of the fire that had gutted his world, the years of emptiness that followed. His voice, steady but threaded with vulnerability, carried the weight of a man who had buried his heart with his family. Success, he admitted, had been a hollow shield, a distraction from the grief that gnawed at him. Then he spoke of Lena, of the night in the restaurant, of her quiet courage in asking for food not for herself but for Theo. She hadn't sought his wealth or his name. She had given him something far greater, a reason to care again. His words were simple, unadorned, and they struck a chord. By morning, the tide of public discourse began to shift. Online forums buzzed with new voices, mothers sharing stories of struggle, fathers recounting moments of quiet heroism, strangers defending Lena's dignity. A teacher in Oregon launched a fundraiser for single parents, inspired by the broadcast. A nurse posted about the countless Lenas she'd seen, invisible to a system that valued paperwork over people. Elias didn't watch the fallout, didn't read the comments. He returned to the hotel where Lena sat with Theo, her expression unreadable. She didn't thank him, didn't need to. Her eyes, though tired, held a flicker of something new, gratitude, perhaps, or the first fragile roots of trust. Weeks passed, and Elias moved Lena and Theo to a small apartment, a modest space with pale yellow walls and windows that caught the morning sun. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs, a sanctuary where Theo's toys scattered across the floor and Lena's sketches, delicate pencil drawings of cityscapes, and Theo's sleeping face began to adorn the walls. Elias visited daily, his presence no longer an intrusion, but a rhythm. He learned the weight of a diaper bag, the pitch of Theo's hungry cry, the way Lena's laughter softened when she thought no one was listening. They didn't define their bond, didn't label it. They simply lived it, moment by moment, in the quiet spaces between Theo's naps and Lena's cautious smiles. One evening, as snow dusted the city, Lena received a letter, slipped under the apartment door like a secret. The handwriting was precise, unmistakably her mother's, a woman she hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years. The note was brief, a tentative request to meet Theo, to mend what had been broken. Lena sat at the kitchen table, the paper creased in her hands, while Theo played nearby, stacking blocks into wobbly towers. She didn't cry, didn't rage, but the silence around her was thick, heavy with the ghosts of rejection. When Elias arrived, he found her staring at the letter, her face a mask of indecision. He read it, then sat beside her, his presence steady, grounding. He didn't push, didn't advise, only waited as she wrestled with the weight of her past. Lena spoke finally, her voice soft but resolute, admitting her fear of reopening old wounds, of exposing Theo to a family that had once turned her away. Elias listened, his gaze steady, and when he spoke, his words were careful, measured. Theo deserved a chance to know his roots, he suggested, even if they were tangled and imperfect. The choice was Lena's, but whatever she decided, he would stand by her. For days she carried the letter, folding and unfolding it until the edges frayed. Then, one crisp morning, she made her decision. With Theo on her hip and Elias at her side, she drove to the small town she had once called home, a place of rolling hills and memories that stung like salt in a wound. The house stood at the end of a gravel drive, its paint peeling, its porch swing creaking in the breeze. Lena paused outside, Theo's weight a comfort against her side, his tiny hands tugging at her scarf. Elias stood back, giving her space, his presence a quiet strength. The door opened, and her mother emerged, her face lined with time and regret. For a moment, no one moved, the air thick with unspoken history. Then, her mother stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Theo, her expression crumbling into something raw and unguarded. Lena's breath caught, her body tensing, but when Theo reached out, curious and unafraid, the moment shattered the silence. Her mother's hands trembled as she reached for him, and Lena, after a heartbeat's hesitation, let her hold him. The older woman cradled Theo, her tears falling silently as she whispered to him, words lost to the wind but heavy with meaning. Lena's father appeared behind her, his face weathered, his eyes tracing the grandson he'd never met. When Lena finally stepped forward, embracing her mother, the moment felt like a quiet exhale, a softening of scars that would never fully fade. They sat together that afternoon, 3 generations around a worn kitchen table, the air filled with the clink of teacups and Theo's soft giggles. Elias watched from the edge of the room, his heart swelling with a quiet pride, not for himself, but for Lena, who had faced her past with a courage he could only admire. As the sun dipped low, casting golden threads across the table, Lena caught Elias's gaze, her eyes shimmering with unspoken gratitude. The drive back to the city was quiet. Theo asleep in his car seat, Lena's hands steady on the wheel. Elias sat beside her, the silence between them not empty but full, a shared understanding that needed no words. The apartment welcomed them back, its walls now bearing more of Lena's drawings, each one a testament to a life slowly reclaimed. Elias stayed longer that evening, helping Lena tuck Theo into bed, his fingers brushing hers as they adjusted the blanket. The touch lingered, brief but electric, a promise of something neither was ready to name. Outside, the city glittered, its lights a constellation of possibilities, and for the first time in years, Elias felt the stirrings of a future he hadn't dared imagine. Spring unfurled across the city like a quiet hymn, its warmth softening the concrete edges and coaxing blossoms from the trees lining Lena's street. The apartment, once a tentative sanctuary, had become a home, its walls now alive with Theo's crayon masterpieces and Lena's sketches, each stroke a testament to a life stitched together from fragments. The space smelled of fresh laundry and the faint citrus of Theo's baby shampoo, a contrast to the cold metal tang of their past. Theo, now a sturdy 2-year-old, toddled through the rooms with fearless curiosity, his laughter a spark that ignited every quiet moment. Lena moved with a newfound steadiness, her auburn hair often loose, catching the light as she worked on her art or played with her son. Elias was woven into their days, his presence as constant as the morning light that spilled through the windows, a rhythm that felt both fragile and inevitable. Their mornings had evolved into a shared ritual, a dance of small intimacies. Elias arrived with a bag of pastries or a new toy for Theo, his tailored coats replaced by soft jackets that Theo loved to pat. They sipped coffee while Theo babbled, his stories a mix of nonsense and wonder, and Lena's laughter crinkling her eyes. Elias mastered the art of slicing fruit into perfect wedges for Theo's tiny hands, learned the lullabies Lena sang when storms rattled the windows. He noticed the way Lena's fingers trembled slightly when she spoke of her past, the way her smile bloomed fully only when Theo was near. They didn't name their bond, didn't rush to define it. It grew in the quiet spaces, Theo's naps, shared glances over dinner, the brush of hands when passing a mug. The world outside had quieted, the frenzy of headlines fading into a distant hum. The photo that once sparked a storm now lingered only in obscure corners of the internet, replaced by newer scandals. Yet its echo lingered in Lena's heart, a reminder of how quickly strangers could rewrite her truth. She guarded Theo fiercely, shielding him from the city's gaze, but the apartment was a haven where she could breathe. Elias, too, carried a quiet vigilance, his wealth a tool he wielded with care, ensuring their safety without smothering Lena's independence. He arranged for Lena to resume her art studies part-time, a scholarship through a foundation he quietly funded, and watched with pride as her sketches evolved into bold canvases, vibrant with color and memory. One afternoon, as summer's first heat shimmered over the city, Lena found a small package tucked beneath the apartment door. Inside was a photograph, yellowed at the edges, showing a young Lena with her parents, their faces soft with a joy she barely remembered. A note accompanied it, written in her mother's precise hand, expressing hope for another visit, a chance to rebuild. Lena held the photo, her thumb tracing her younger self, a girl unburdened by loss. Theo played nearby, stacking blocks into a wobbly castle, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Lena didn't cry, but her silence was heavy, a tangle of longing and caution. When Elias arrived, he found her at the kitchen table, the photo beside a cooling cup of tea. He sat with her, reading the note, his presence a steady anchor. Lena spoke of her hesitation, the fear of reopening doors that had once slammed shut. Her parents had reached out twice since their visit to the old house, each gesture tentative, each one met with Lena's guarded heart. Elias listened, his gaze unwavering, and suggested that Theo might one day want to know his grandparents, flawed as they were. The choice was hers, he added, but he would stand by her, whatever she decided. Lena folded the photo, tucking it into a drawer, and for weeks it remained there, a quiet question she wasn't ready to answer. But one evening, as Theo napped and the city hummed below, she pulled it out, her fingers steady. She booked a train ticket for the following weekend, a journey back to the town of her childhood, with Elias and Theo by her side. The visit was quieter than the first, less fraught with raw emotion, but no less significant. Her parents' house stood unchanged, its porch swing still creaking, its garden now blooming with late summer roses. Theo ran ahead, chasing a butterfly, while Lena and Elias followed, their steps slow. Her mother greeted them at the door, her face softer, her hands clasped nervously. Her father stood behind, his eyes bright with a cautious hope. Theo, unburdened by history, toddled to them, offering a crumpled dandelion, and the gesture broke the tension like a sigh. They spent the day in the garden, Theo playing in the grass while Lena and her parents spoke in halting truths, mending what they could. Elias watched, his heart full, a silent witness to a family finding its way back. Back in the city, life settled into a gentle cadence. Lena's art flourished, her work catching the eye of a local gallery, a small but significant step. Elias attended her first exhibition, standing quietly as strangers praised her bold lines and vivid hues, his pride a warmth he didn't voice. Theo grew taller, his vocabulary a mix of wonder and mischief, calling Elias by a nickname, Eli, that felt like a gift. The apartment became a canvas of their shared life, a shelf of Lena's paints, a box of Theo's trains, a photo of the three of them at the park, laughing under a canopy of leaves. They were not a family in name, not yet, but in the quiet moments, reading bedtime stories, sharing meals, watching Theo chase pigeons, they were something deeper, something true. One crisp autumn day, they returned to the park where Elias had first followed Lena, its paths now dusted with fallen leaves. The air was sharp, the sky a clear blue that seemed to hold its breath. They spread a blanket under an ancient oak, its branches heavy with memory, and unpacked a picnic of sandwiches and Theo's favorite apple slices. Theo ran in circles, his laughter a melody, while Lena and Elias watched, their shoulders brushing. The moment felt ordinary, yet sacred, a tapestry woven from countless small choices. Elias reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around a small velvet box, his heart steady but full. He didn't kneel, didn't stage a grand gesture. Instead, he turned to Lena, his eyes soft, and opened the box to reveal a simple ring, its band etched with a delicate vine, chosen for its quiet beauty. He spoke of the night they met, of her courage in the restaurant, of how she and Theo had pulled him from a darkness he thought was permanent. She hadn't asked for his help, hadn't needed his wealth, but had given him a purpose, a reason to wake each morning. The ring wasn't a claim, he said, but a promise to stand beside her, to love Theo as his own, to build a life together, imperfect but theirs. Lena's breath caught, her eyes shimmering with tears that didn't fall. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, and nodded, a smile breaking through like dawn. They embraced, Theo toddling over to join them, his small arms wrapping around their legs, a circle complete. The ceremony was simple, held in the same park weeks later, under the oak's watchful boughs. No lavish decor, no flashing cameras, just a handful of friends, a linen cloth spread with wildflowers, and Theo in a tiny vest, clutching a pillow with the rings. Lena wore a dress of soft ivory, its hem brushing the grass, her hair loose and glowing in the sunlight. Elias stood beside her, his face unguarded, his eyes tracing her as if she were the only truth he knew. They exchanged vows, quiet promises of love and resilience, while Theo tugged at Elias's sleeve, chirping Eli with a grin. When the officiant pronounced them bound, Theo clapped, his joy a spark that lit the air, and the small crowd laughed, their applause soft but warm. As they danced on the grass, Theo between them, the world felt both vast and small, a universe held in their shared gaze. Elias thought of Clara and Ivy, not with pain but with gratitude, their memory a quiet blessing rather than a wound. Lena thought of her past, its scars now part of her strength, a map that led her here. Theo, unaware of the weight of their journey, simply danced, his laughter a bridge between their yesterdays and tomorrows. They were not perfect, not untouched by loss, but they were together, and that was enough. The years that followed were a tapestry of quiet triumphs. Lena's art gained recognition, her work a voice for those unseen, her gallery shows drawing crowds who saw their own stories in her colors. Elias stepped back from his empire, focusing on philanthropy, funding shelters and scholarships in Clara's name, always with Lena's input. Theo grew into a boy of boundless curiosity, his questions a daily delight, his love for Eli and Mama a constant thread. They moved to a house with a garden where Theo planted sunflowers and Lena painted under the stars, Elias often joining her, his hands stained with paint, his laughter free. Their story, born from a whispered question in a gilded room, became a quiet legend, not for its drama, but for its truth. It wasn't about a billionaire's redemption or a mother's survival, but about two people who found each other in the dark and chose to walk toward the light. Theo, once cradled in a stranger's arms, now ran ahead, his voice calling them home. And in every step, every shared glance, they carried the miracle of compassion, the kind that turns a single moment into a lifetime.